Hello, hello, beautiful listener. My name is AP Mobley, and I'm your host here at the Myths and Folktales and Fairy Tales podcast. I'm also the author of dark fantasy inspired by mythology, so if you ever wanted to check out my books, I'd really appreciate it. Man, it's been a while since we last talked, hasn't it? I was hoping to record this episode a little earlier in November, but I took some time to visit family, and I was also really busy finishing up a manuscript for author D.R. Mills so that he can start prepping that title for publication. In case you didn't know, DR is a horror author that I do line edits and proofreads for. Yup, you heard that right. I edit as well as try to keep up with all my other projects. But years and years before I was DR's editor, I was just his friend and writing buddy. We're still friends. Honestly, he's one of my best friends, and we have a long running joke that we're actually twins separated at birth because we're so alike. But yeah, back in 2020, he decided that he wanted to turn this script for a TV show that he'd been writing into a book series. The series is called Monsters, and basically it's structured like a long TV show with seasons and episodes. But instead of watching the episodes, you read them in novel form. Monsters is YA horror slash like dark contemporary fantasy. And the best way that I can describe it is supernatural meets Stranger Things. I think if you ever enjoyed those TV shows or the Goosebumps books or the Cirque du Freak books, you'd probably enjoy Monsters. From what DR has told me, book 5 in the Monster series is being published very soon, and he has 2 free prequels available for readers. So if you're interested in checking out his stuff, I'll leave those prequels linked in the description. I will say though, my favorite book that he's written is his upcoming novel, an adult horror comedy called Riley Doesn't Want to Fight Evil. It's the first in his Riley trilogy, and when I read it, I knew right away that it was going to be something special. He has grown so much as a writer, and I have grown so much as an editor, and I am just so pleased with how the Riley books are coming together. I've already asked him if when book 1 comes out that he'll join us here on the podcast to talk about the book and some of the lore that influenced it, and he agreed to do that. So definitely keep your eyes peeled because that's going to be a really fun bonus episode. All right. Now that I've explained why this episode is a bit late and rambled for Lord knows how long, it's time to get into today's subject, which is all about some of the creation and underworld myths from Mesopotamian mythology. I apologize in advance for any names or other words I might horribly mispronounce. This will be the first episode in the second section of the podcast, which, as I mentioned in the Cauldron of Rebirth episode, will be all about creation, afterlife, and underworld myths from around the world. For reference, ancient Mesopotamia was roughly located in what we know today as Iraq, but it did extend into a few other modern day Middle Eastern countries as well. The reason I chose to discuss Mesopotamian myths for this first episode of the section is because it's often referred to as the cradle of civilization. A lot of our earliest known written literature comes from Mesopotamia, and it's my understanding that Sumerian is the oldest known written language in the world. Because Mesopotamian mythology is so old, it's theorized that it influenced some of the stories from Greek mythology. For example, people have drawn parallels between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Odyssey and the Iliad. And there's even some crossover between Mesopotamian mythology and stories in the Bible. Obviously, ancient Mesopotamia influenced lots of other cultures and probably their stories, but I could dedicate a whole episode to that subject alone, so I'll stop here. Now, let's talk about Mesopotamian creation myths. Ancient Mesopotamia wasn't just one unified civilization. It encompassed the Sumerian civilization, the Akkadian and Assyrian empires, and Babylon. Consequently, Mesopotamia doesn't have a single unified creation myth, but the consensus seems to be that the gods always existed, even before people and animals and everything else existed. The creation myth that I want to discuss today is the Eridu Genesis, but it's also known as the Sumerian flood story. The only issue with this version of the story is that it's fragmented. Like many texts from ancient Mesopotamia, there are lines and even entire passages of the text missing, so scholars have had to guess and play fill in the blanks with some portions of it. Thankfully, there's another story that came later, called Atrahasis, which references the Great Flood as well. Scholars have been able to use Atrahasis to help fill in some of the blanks for the Sumerian flood story. Our tale begins with the gods, also called the Anunnaki in Mesopotamian mythology, and some of them have undertaken the task of creating animals and the black-headed people, which is how the text refers to the Sumerian people. The gods in question are Anu, a sky god, Enlil, a storm god, Enki, a water god, and Ninursag, a mother goddess. The four of them work together to create animals and the Sumerian people, and then they create cities for the Sumerian people and assign patron gods to the cities and whatnot. From everything I've read, it appears that a common theme among the varying myths is that humanity is meant to serve the gods. In Atrahasis, humans are literally created to do the hard labor that the lower gods are tired of doing. Back to our story. Things don't end at the creation of humans and animals and civilization. Anu and Enlil end up trying to wipe out all the lovely people they created with a great flood. There's a bunch of lines missing. In the translation I'm reading, which is from the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, it says that approximately 34 lines are missing between the section where cities are established and the section where the flood happens. It seems that this is one of those times where scholars have used the Atrahasis story to fill in the blanks. In Atrahasis, the gods decide to kill off humanity because humans are really noisy and annoying. Yup, you heard that right. The gods decide that the most logical course of action is to just kill their people, rather than to ask them to keep it down because all the noise they're making is getting irritating. The rest of the Anunnaki swear an oath to not interfere with Anu and Enlil's flood plan, but Enki finds a loophole in the oath. Rather than directly warning this king and priest, who is named Ziutsura, about the flood, Enki speaks to a wall about how the flood is going to come, and he knows that the king is on the other side of the wall and can hear him. It says that approximately 38 lines are missing after this, so this is another part where scholars play fill in the blanks. Later in the story, we see that the king built a boat and filled it with people and animals so that when the flood comes, they don't all drown. So we can assume that those missing lines were the part where he builds that boat and fills it up. It says next in the text that all the windstorms and gales arose together, and then that the flood sweeps over the land, and that waves and windstorms rock the huge boat for 7 days and 7 nights. Then Utu, the sun god, comes out. The king drills a hole in the boat so that Utu can enter the boat with his rays, and the king worships Utu and makes sacrifices for the god and whatnot. It says that the next lines are too fragmentary for translation, and then another 33 lines are missing. But the conclusion of the story seems to be Anu and Enlil realizing the error of their ways. They seem to be grateful that Ziutsura saved humanity and the animals, because it says in the text that they treat the king kindly, that they give him eternal life, and that they make him the king of the country where the sun rises. So I guess it all works out in the end. All right, we've talked a bit about ancient Mesopotamia and the Sumerian myth explaining how humans came to be. But if you're anything like me, you might now be wondering, what does the Mesopotamian underworld look like? What is it called? And are there any stories surrounding it? For me, one of the best parts of learning about any mythology is learning about its underworld. I don't know why, but these stories seriously ignite my imagination. I explored the ancient Greek underworld a bit in my debut novel, The Helm of Darkness, and you can expect to see lots of other underworlds and even other interpretations of the Greek underworld in my future books, so do stay tuned. Coming back to the topic at hand, in Mesopotamian mythology, the underworld has quite a few different names. Some names I've seen used a lot are Urkala or Kur. Now, I personally like the way Urkala sounds just a little bit more than Kur, so I'll be referring to the Mesopotamian underworld as Urkala in this episode. But Urkala is really interesting because from everything I've read, it appears to be different from other underworlds from around the world. In Norse mythology, there are multiple underworlds, and the way you die determines which underworld you go to. And then in Greek and Egyptian mythology, your life and your deeds are measured, and where you spend eternity depends on what kind of life you led. But in Mesopotamian mythology, it seems like everyone goes to the same place, Urkala. If you're evil, you go to Urkala. If you're good, you go to Urkala. The souls in Urkala never see light, their only food being dust and clay. They also have to rely on libations from their living descendants if they want to drink something. Now, while I adore underworld myths from around the world, my very favorite definitely comes from Mesopotamian mythology, and it's called Inanna's Descent. I'd like to talk about Inanna's Descent first, mostly because it's my favorite. And then I'll talk about one more Mesopotamian underworld myth before the end of the episode. Our tale begins with Inanna or Ishtar, the powerful Mesopotamian goddess of love, beauty, and war. She's decided to pay her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, a visit in Urkala, because Ereshkigal's husband has just died. For this visit, the text says that Inanna takes the 7 divine powers and grasped them in her hand. And then it goes on to list a bunch of clothing and jewelry that she puts on. She's got like a wig or a crown, special dress, a lapis lazuli necklace, a breastplate, egg-shaped beads on her breasts, a lapis lazuli rod, and a golden ring or bracelet. But the exact articles of clothing do vary slightly between the Sumerian and Akkadian versions of the story that I've read. Anyway, the fact that the list of clothing and the jewelry comes right after the mention of her taking the quote unquote 7 divine powers makes me feel like there could be power in the clothing and jewelry here. Anywho, Inanna dons all this special gear and heads down from heaven to the land of the dead. She bangs on the door and tells the gatekeeper, Nettie, to let her in. Nettie lets Ereshkigal know what's going on, and Ereshkigal is like, the only way Inanna can come in is if, at each of the 7 gates of Urkala, she removes a piece of clothing. Inanna's like, fine, sure, we'll do that. And at each of the 7 gates, she removes a piece of clothing. By the time Inanna reaches the throne room, she's naked, and Ereshkigal and the other beings in the underworld are like, hey, we've determined that you didn't come here to pay your respects to the king of the underworld. You've come because you want to seize power from your sister and become even more powerful. As punishment, Inanna is struck dead and hung on a hook. Obviously, Inanna doesn't return to heaven because she's been struck dead, and her servant gets worried and starts asking the other gods if they'll help get her back. Enki agrees to help, and he sends some demons down to Urkala to retrieve Inanna. The demons give Inanna the food and water of life, and she rises from the dead. However, Inanna can't leave Urkala without someone taking her place. She decides that whoever takes her place has to be someone who didn't mourn her properly in her absence. As it turns out, everyone except for her husband, Dumuzi, a shepherd god, has been mourning her properly. While she was gone, Dumuzi feasted, dressed lavishly, and entertained himself with slave girls. Furious and heartbroken, Inanna chooses him to take her place in Urkala. Eventually, however, Dumuzi's sister Geshtinana ends up sharing the burden of being a prisoner of Urkala with Dumuzi. It's decided that for half of the year, Dumuzi will be trapped in Urkala, and for the other half, Geshtinana will be trapped. This is how the ancient Mesopotamians explained the changing seasons, similarly to how the ancient Greeks explained the changing seasons with the Demeter, Hades, Persephone myth. While Inanna's descent is definitely my favorite Mesopotamian and underworld myth, there's another Mesopotamian underworld myth that I think is really interesting as well. This one stars Inanna's sister, Ereshkigal, and it tells how Ereshkigal married her second husband, since the guy she was married to before Inanna's descent obviously passed away. This story begins with a banquet in heaven. Since Ereshkigal is queen of the underworld, she can't leave Urkala to join in on the banquet, so she sends her helper Namtar to the banquet in her place. During the banquet, the Anunnaki treat Namtar with a fair amount of respect, but one god mistreats him, that god being Nergal, the god of war and disease. And when Ereshkigal hears about the way Nergal disrespected Namtar at the party, she demands that Nergal come down to Urkala and atone for what he's done. Now, Nergal agrees to Ereshkigal's demands, but before he leaves, Inky advises him to not eat, drink, wash, or accept any general hospitality while in Urkala. Even more important than that, though, Inky advises Nergal to not sleep with Ereshkigal while in Urkala. Nergal is like, okay, yeah, sure, sounds easy enough, and travels to Urkala. While Nergal is in Urkala, he successfully abstains from food and drink. However, he can't resist the temptation of Ereshkigal. They spend 6 passionate days together, and in those 6 days, they fall in love. But for some reason, on what would have been their 7th day together, Nergal flees the underworld and runs back to heaven. Distraught by Nergal's absence, Ereshkigal sends Namtar to look for him. However, Namtar can't find Nergal because Inky has disguised Nergal as a lesser god. In the end, Nergal does come back to Urkala to be with Ereshkigal of his own free will. They get married, and Nergal becomes the new king of the underworld. Before I go, I thought I'd let you know that if you're interested in reading my free book, Wrath of Persephone, the link to download the ebook is in this episode's description. If you want more myths, folktales, and fairy tales, I've also included the link to my myths, folktales, and fairy tales blog in the description. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for the next Creation and Underworld Myths episode, which will be all about the creation and afterlife stories from Egyptian mythology. I'll see you next time!